Welcome to Shield Maidens, Women of the Norse World, the podcast that celebrates the remarkable women of the Viking Age. From fierce warriors and powerful queens to wise seers and cunning goddesses, these women left an indelible mark on history. Join authors Johanna Wittenberg and K.S. Barton each month as we explore the stories, achievements, and impact of Norse women. Welcome to Shield Maidens, Women of the Norse World. This is episode 17, in which Johanna and I discuss women's work, of which there was plenty. So I can't remember who wrote this, so I apologize to the author. But she said of women in the Viking Age that, quote, women were masters and commanders on Viking farms, which I actually really love. It's a really good visual of how important they were. And women's work has been mostly ignored by historians until just a few decades ago, when there arose an interest in understanding the lives of everyday people, as opposed to only studying kings and queens and battles and wars. They really historians started studying diaries and letters and things like that of just ordinary people. But even still, things like women's work, like weaving, still gets overlooked. And it shouldn't be, because if it hadn't been for the countless hours that Viking Age women spent spinning wool and flax, weaving, sewing, the Viking Age might not have ever happened. Because a sail on a Viking longship was extremely important to them being able to set out on their voyages. And who made those sails? Women did. And those Viking warriors, they also needed clothes and mittens, socks, undergarments, bedding. And who made all of that? Of course, it was women. And then women also cooked all the food they ate and brewed the beer they drank. So we have much appreciation to those Viking Age women. So I'm K.S. Barton, and I'm the author of the Norse Family series, the story of the young daughter of a Jarl and a Viking warrior who are caught in a deadly blood feud between two brothers. And with me is Johanna Wittenberg. Hi, Johanna.
Hello. I'm Johanna Wittenberg, author of the Norse Women series, which is the story of a real Norse queen who ruled at the dawn of the Viking Age. So we'll start with brewing. And in the Viking Age, much of life centered around ale, the brewing of it, the drinking of it, and the serving of it. And the images come to mind of rowdy beer bashes with men in horned helmets, guzzling the drink provided by subservient women. That's not exactly the way it happened. In fact, there's a deep significance, and it followed a strict formal precedence. Hosting beer celebrations was once required by law in Scandinavia. Imbibing was a religious act. Celebrating Yule was referred to as drinking Yule. The Christianized Gulating law actually cites the required ale feasts that were to be held before All Saints' Day and another on Holy Night to give thanks to Christ and Mary for peaceful and fruitful harvest. This is strongly reminiscent of the Yule feasts of pagan times, when toasts were made to Odin for victory in the war, to Freyr for peace and prosperity, and to the king. Also, the mini cup is drunk in remembrance of ancestors and the dead. Ale parties had legal status in many situations. Neighbors were invited to the ale feast as witnesses to events such as adopting illegitimate children into the family, divorces, or the liberation of a slave. In Viking times, brewing was a sacred duty performed by women. They stirred the ale or the mead with a brew stick. It was carefully preserved and passed down the generations. These sticks were inoculated with wild yeast, and after they were used, they were hung up to dry in the brew house, but never washed. When the yeast became active, it was said that the briggamen, the elves of the brew, were chattering. So far from being subservient barmaids, women had an authoritative role in providing ale. Serving rituals and precedents were strictly observed by the highest ranking lady of the house. She served people in order of their rank and thereby established status. The epic poem Beowulf makes it really clear that the lady of the house assigned the status of everyone in the room by the order in which she served the attendees. There were a number of different types of fermented drinks in the Viking Age, from small beer that was drunk every day, even by children, to the stronger ales and mead. Viking Age ale and beer were flavored very differently from what we drink now. Hops did not really come into usage until later in the Viking Age. So they used juniper berries very commonly, as well as medicinal herbs. And it's thought that in some cases, hallucinogenics may have been added, like cannabis or henbane, maybe even mushrooms. And there's some theories that this might be the cause of berserkergang, or going berserk, an altered state of consciousness for warriors. The vulvas trance is also thought to result from the consumption of hallucinogens.
So you mentioned the juniper berries. That's still a big thing, and at least in Swedish cooking and stuff like that. Yeah, I still use juniper berries in several things.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. And I was thinking about the mini cup. Is that related to the word memory?
It is.
Like Moonin, Odin's Raven Moonin.
Exactly.
So, you're remembering.
So it's the cup of remembrance, or the drink of remembrance. And it's a toast to the departed.
That's nice. I like that idea of toasting your ancestors. And it's so funny because as you were talking about this, I was thinking, well, I guess that's one stereotype about Vikings that's true, about everybody drinking. And wasn't there a thing at one point, like at Yule, people were supposed to drink a certain amount of beer? Like
they had to provide a certain amount. A farmer had to provide a certain amount of ale and host at least, I think it was 3 drinking parties during the season. And if he didn't, he could be fined and even outlawed if it went on too long. So if somebody was really stingy and didn't have a drinking party, he was cast out of society.
Huh. I thought I'd read somewhere that there was also something that said you had to drink a certain amount.
Maybe
it wasn't like an act. Maybe it wasn't an actual law. Maybe it was one of those things like if you couldn't drink this much, then you were weak or something.
Right.
like that story with Thor when he goes to the castle of the giant Utgard Loki and he's drinking from the cup and they're making fun of him because he couldn't drain it in one drink. Like, oh, even the smallest child can drink that beer in one drink, and he couldn't do it because it was actually the ocean.
Yeah, they were tricking him.
yeah, but that it made me think of that. Like, you have to be able to drink a certain amount. Or
well, I know there is one test of competence. You know, whether you're mentally competent, if you can ride to an ale party.
Friends don't let friends ride drunk.
I don't think that held too much sway back then.
No, I don't think there was too much danger. Oh my gosh. And I wish I would have looked this up before. Of the story about Yule, is it King Harold who goes up north and he's a Christian and he wants them to convert and he won't drink the ale because there was horse's blood in it. Anyway, I can't remember. I know he wouldn't eat the horse flesh because he was a Christian.
Wasn't it Saint Olaf?
Oh, Olaf. That's right. Yes. Yeah.
And he attended, he had the ale feast, the Yule feast, and it wasn't the ale. It was there was they were supposed to eat horse meat, and he refused. And that was one of the things that set Christians apart. They would not eat horse meat. And so they had a broth that was from the horse meat, because they boiled everything. They didn't really roast things that much. Yeah. They boiled them in these big cauldrons. And so they brought him the broth, and he was supposed to drink the broth, and he wouldn't. And so he inhaled the broth.
That's right. Okay. Yeah.
But eventually that didn't work any longer. Eventually he was overthrown for this reason, because the people really believed if the king wouldn't do that, their crops would fail and their livestock would die. And it was a big deal to them. So that was the main reason that Christianity what had so much trouble taking hold, especially in Norway, was because the farmers really did believe that, it was Freyr and Freya that blessed the crops.
Yeah.
And they wouldn't have a healthy harvest, so they'd all starve.
And wasn't it Sweden? It took until around 1000 before they completely converted.
Norway too.
Oh, was it that late in Norway?
And Iceland. Most of the Scandinavian countries. I think Denmark was the earliest, but yeah, because they went back and forth in Norway. They had a couple of kings that were Christian, but then they were overthrown or killed. And then they got new kings that were pagan. So they went back and forth quite a bit. And it wasn't until around the year 1000 that the conversion was complete. I mean, thousands of years of these beliefs that they had, and then you can't overthrow it overnight.
Right. Yeah. Especially like now out in the country and places that are farther from the king's influence. Yeah.
And they didn't really have cities in the Viking age, not until late in the Viking age. They had some trading ports that were kind of town-like, but they were all farmers. They were all lived in the country on farms that were pretty far apart.
Especially in places like Norway with all those fjords and the mountains. And
the land in Norway was not all that great for farming. So it was critical, very critical for survival that their crops be good.
So it's interesting. I'm thinking about this, like, why would the brewing, is it because they're drinking their calories, with having the carbohydrates in the beer that it would help them? Like, why would they make that like mandatory that you would have to have like these?
I don't know.
It was just a way to get people together, I'm just like,
I don't think that they, because they believed that, they didn't add yeast to the brew. They inoculated it with a brew stick, and it was the wild yeast from the air, which is actually, it's a thing. I know people who bake bread that way. They don't add yeast to their dough. They just let it become inoculated. And so they did believe that it was magical. So the brew stick was a magical thing. And so it was all bound up with magic and religion. And then the fact that it could give you, especially if depending on what they added to it, they could give you an altered state of consciousness. So certainly, I think a more of a magical thing. So I don't know. I don't know, but for sure.
I always think about stuff like that. Yeah. Why would that be? Why would they do that?
I'm sure it evolved over centuries.
Yeah, that too. I think I mentioned this to you once with the not washing the brew stick. Reminds me of like, at least in the martial art I did, Aikido, that you don't ever wash your belt. Because that's where you hold your ki, your energy. Yeah, of course you wash your uniform and all that, but you're not supposed to wash your belt because that's where you hang on to your ki. So.
Yeah, and when you think about what's in the air, and wild yeast is in the air, and it can make bread rise, and it can make beer ferment. That's like ki.
Yeah, it is. It's all energy. Yeah,
it's the same kind of a thing. Very interesting.
Yeah. So there are a couple of stories that I found in the sagas that have brewing, where brewing is. Oh, wait, a couple of them? No, wait, it was just this one. I'm thinking of something else.
And this is one that I haven't heard, so I'm really interested in it.
This comes from the saga of Hath and his warriors. So there's another story in it about a king named Alrik who ruled over Hordaland in Norway. Now, King Alrik already had a wife, but his retainer, Cole, told the king about the beauty of this woman, Gerhild. He'd seen her brewing beer and thought she'd be good for the king. So now Odin, who was in disguise as he always was and calling himself Hood, went to visit Gerhild, and he made a bargain with her. She would marry King Alrik, but that she must call on Hood for all things. Now that sounds like a bargain. I would say, no.
Kind of like the bargain with the devil.
Exactly. But maybe she really wanted to marry the king. So later, King Alrik saw Gerhild on his way home, and he fell for her, and they married that autumn.
Oh.
Yes. So King Ulrich's wife and Gerhild did not get along. So I've seen this in other sagas about how the wife and the mistress don't get along, which makes sense to me, I mean, but it's also a reminder that even though it was common for men, especially kings and other like warlords, to have mistresses, it wasn't necessarily okay with the women, neither the wife or the mistress. But I mean, maybe some wives appreciated that now there'd be another woman to help with the chores. Who knows? Maybe she was resentful. But anyway, Gerhild and King Ulrich's wife, Signy, didn't get along. So that must have been to the point where Ulrich figured he must choose one of the women. And he figured he would choose the woman to keep by who brewed the best beer. And he'd give them the summer. So he'd decide when he came home from his summer raiding. Now his wife, Signy, prayed to Freya as she made her beer. And Gerhild called on Hood or Odin because that was her bargain. She had to call on him for help for all things. Odin spat into her vat of beer and said he'd return for what was between her and the vat of beer. And then he left. Gerhild's beer turned out to be good. But then King Ulrich, he must have had some foresight or something, because he says, Gerhild, girl, good is this ale. I can't complain unless there's a catch. I see hanging on high gallows your son, woman, sold to Odin.
Ooh.
So I don't know how King Ulrich saw that. But
Wow.
So what was between Gerhild and that vat of beer was her pregnant stomach. And in that held her son, Vikar. So that's what she offered up to Odin, was her unborn son at the time.
Unknowingly.
Yes. And that seems like a fairy tale. I mean, that's where fairy tales come from, are these myths, things to do. Somebody, you can't do something, somebody offers to, some mythical being offers to help. You say, okay, because you're desperate to get their help. And then you're not quite sure how this is all how this debt will be repaid.
Yeah, it's always a big catch. It's always something you never guess.
Yeah, like King Ulrich. I can't complain unless there's a catch. But unfortunately, in this particular saga, there's no mention of Vikar's death. But there is another Vikar who dies by hanging in another saga, in Gautric's saga. But this Vikar is a king, and he had his most favored warrior. This is a man named Starcad, which I wrote that name down because I have to remember that. I need a character named Starcad. It's what a cool name. So when King Vikar and his warriors were at sea, when they were out there summer raiding, they were hit by unfavorable winds. So they anchored at an island. And once they were there, they did some divination to figure out what they were supposed to do. And they were told that they had to make a sacrifice to Odin. So they drew lots, and King Vikar's name kept coming up. But because he was
Odin really wanted him.
Really wanted King Vikar. I mean, it said he was a great king, so that's probably why Odin wanted him. But of course, his men don't want him to be the one sacrificed. And so that night, Starcad's foster father appeared to him and took him to a council meeting with 12 men. 2 of them were Odin and Thor.
Oh.
Yeah. And in the saga, there's a lot of back and forth. Like one of them would give the Starcad something and the other would take something away or make it or be a catch. But ultimately, they decided that Odin required that King Vikar be sacrificed by hanging and stabbing.
Ah, the dual death.
Yes.
That was also something that was really common in these old stories. Multiple deaths.
Yeah. But Starcad and his foster father thought they'd trick Odin. Yeah, nice try, guys. So they thought they'd use a noose made out of intestines because they would be stretchy, and a thin reed as a spear. But you're not going to trick Odin. And as soon as King Vikar put his head in that noose, it turned into rope. And then the thin reed turned into a spear, and he was actually sacrificed. That was the end of King Vikar. So I don't know. There could have been like somehow the stories got mixed up in the telling, 2 different stories. were kind of conflated. Maybe they got mixed up when they were written down. But
They sound
that
like they
seems,
go together, though.
except
You
King
know,
Vikar in Gotrek saga is not the same Vikar as was born to Gerhild and Alric. So it's not,
does he have a different father?
yeah, I
How
think
do you know
so.
he's not the same?
I think he has a different father.
Oh, okay. But
Yeah.
it kind of makes sense that they, that so this the promise that Odin gives is that he'd become a great king, but he's got to be sacrificed to him in the end. And so anyway, it
Yeah.
could be true that
Yeah.
it's one and the same.
Yeah. I just thought I love the bargain that
Yeah.
what was between me and your beer. And this also reminded me of Rumpelstiltskin. You know
Mhm.
how he ultimately asks for her firstborn child. I
Yep.
think that's the last thing he asks for. So,
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah.
That was an interesting little story about brewing and how important it was to that king. That was the thing that he was going to use to decide which woman he wanted to keep, was how good she could brew beer.
Well, and I really think that I can understand that because brewing beer, especially back then where they didn't have refrigeration, they didn't necessarily have the ability to clean things the way we did. I mean, I'm sure a lot of batches of beer went off and
Mm.
failed, spoiled, whatever. So it was a big deal. I don't make nearly as big a deal of it in my stories as it probably was. But I've been reading this book called I think it's Make Mead Like a Viking. It's a really cute book, but it talks about brewing in general and how they did it in the Viking age, and the fact that they couldn't sterilize things, or they
Right.
didn't necessarily know to do that, but they, as long as they took care, it's like baking bread too. Is similar. Beer and bread are almost the same thing. It's just that beer has more water.
Yeah, that's true.
Same ingredients, pretty much.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, there is
Well,
one thing that we do know that the Viking Age women did a lot of.
yes, weaving. In the Viking era, weaving was considered the domain of women, and according to Michelle Hyer Smith in her book, The Valkyrie's Loom, it was associated with the goddess Freya and Sather, which is witchcraft and magic that men feared. They feared women's power and they believed it could destroy their manliness. The god Odin learned Sather from Freya, but he could practice it without losing his manliness because he was a god, at least so we can assume.
Mm-hmm.
But all cloth production in those days was very labor intensive. But linen was perhaps the most labor intensive and very highly prized. So in my first book, The Norse Queen, I have this passage about flax planting and harvest. And so I'll read that because I couldn't describe it more just by rewriting it. So I'll just read what I have there. So when the flax had finished blooming and gone to seed, and the plants had turned from green to yellow, indicating the fibers within were at their strongest and finest to make the best linen, Osa rounded up the women and led them out to the field to harvest. Even the shield maidens abandoned their swordplay to pull up the plants, roots and all. They left the harvested flax in the fields to dry under the late summer sun while they resumed battle practice. After a week, they took up big iron-toothed combs to thresh the seeds from the stalks and stored them in sacks in the granary. The flax stalks they hauled off to a still pond downwind of the hall and set them to soak for another week. When Osa appeared on the practice field with a handful of straws, everyone groaned. They dutifully lined up and drew their straw, and the short straw fell to Yrsa. She sighed and trudged off to the foul-smelling pool where she fished in the mire to see if the tough outer stems had rotted off. She returned, shaking her head, and the next day someone else had to go to check. On the day a girl returned from the pool to report the stems had fallen away, all the women descended on the pond to gather the slimy, reeking stalks.
Ew.
They rinsed away the odor in a swift running brook and lugged their sodden harvest back to the yard, where every woman and girl joined in beating the plants with wooden clubs to break the woody outer husk. They laid the stalks on a board and scraped the husks away with the scutching knives to expose the soft inner fibers. And these they combed through a fine-toothed heckle until they lay straight and silky, ready for the winter spinning.
Wow.
Yeah,
That
it's
is a
quite
lot of work.
process.
Yeah. And linen was more used by like the upper classes. Yeah. It was.
Well, actually, all the
No.
undergarments were, as I understand it, they were all linen because it was more comfortable close to the skin. But and they lasted. Linen is a very tough fabric. But one thing that I thought was very interesting is that they pleated it.
They did.
They pleated their linen undergarment for royalty. I mean, not for everyday people,
Okay.
but there are actually images of women they have what they call a smoother. So they have like a board, and then they have these heavy like glass and other things that they think are linen smoothers. So I don't know. I mean, I've ironed linen before, and I do not know how you would manage to pleat it without heat, but we don't know for sure. But they have found things in graves that they think are smoothers, linen smoothers, and maybe they're people who've never tried ironing linen before. I mean, you need the spray starch or at least a spray bottle of water, and you need plenty of heat and steam to get those pleats in there. But they're in fact, I even think that little figurine of the Shield Maiden, I think she has a pleated underdress, if I remember right. Anyway, there are images of women with pleated underdresses that are made of linen, and
I have
pretty hard. It's hard to pleat wool. I guess you could, but anyway, that's all we know about. We don't know a lot about Viking fashion, but we do know that.
Yeah. Well, yeah, some reenactors, it's interesting to see what they come up with like undergarments and stuff. Yeah. I imagine they had to wear quite a few layers. So yeah.
No doubt.
At least in the winter.
Well, and go ahead.
Go ahead.
Well, you were saying that the grave sites of women often had spinning and weaving equipment. And the Oseberg burial ship, the grave site, which is a grave of two women from the early Viking age, contained many different examples of weaving equipment, like iron shears. There were 3 looms. One was a vertical warp-weighted loom. Also 2 sets of tablets for weaving those decorative tablet bands. And there are fragments of pictorial tapestries of what appears to be a procession. And these were found all caked together, which they've teased apart so that they can actually see some of them, but there's an awful lot that we can't see. And there's also a really large fabric that might be a sail, could be an awning. There were lots of pieces of down and also fragments of the women's clothing.
Yeah, it's really beautiful. I wish we paid that more attention like we do the Bayeux tapestry.
They're starting to, they're especially Marianne Videller, who's with the University of Oslo. She's done a couple books that are about the Oseberg. So, but this is more than 100, it's 120 years later. We're finally getting around to it. Yikes.
Yeah, and the tapestry shows us that, women would use textiles as storytelling. So I wonder how often they would do that in a subversive ways. And now I have an idea for something in a story I'm writing.
Yeah, good question. That's a very good question.
Yeah, I bet they did. I bet there were like secret things that maybe they were doing.
Well, I know the Oseberg tapestry has symbols in it that are definitely magical. So they've got like a Flyfoot, which is the swastika, which meant something very different back then. They have birds and ravens that are, some are going up, some are going down. They have these spears and arrows that aren't attached to anything and they're pointing up. Those things mean things, but we don't know what And there's some other symbols that I can't even describe in that tapestry. We just don't know what those things mean, but they were definitely magical and symbolic in some way. Of course, we don't really even know what those tapestries represented. They seem to represent a procession of some kind, but nobody knows. And we probably never will know exactly whether it was something real, whether it was um, a mythological scene. They have the tree with the hanged man hanging from it. And they have women who are definitely vulvas portrayed on this tapestry. This is probably the most elaborate pictorial portrayal of scenes from the Viking Age that we have. I mean, the other things are like wood carvings, but they're not actual scenes. Very little has actual scenes in it.
Yeah, there's a few stone things too.
But they're not like necessarily scenes from everyday life. Like
right, they're often the gods,
be.
like Odin on his horse and things like that. Yeah,
very interesting.
Yes. Well, spinning and weaving were, as we've shown, were no easy tasks. These poor Viking women, they just couldn't go to the store to buy their clothes. And it took a long time, as you could tell from just that process of even getting the flax so you could even spin it took a long time. And then it would take time to spin it and to turn it into thread or yarn or whatever they called it. And then you'd have to sew it with something. It could take weeks, months, even up. I read some things that it could take almost a full year for a woman or two, depending on how big the household was, for the women to spin and weave and sew everything they needed for the household.
Yeah. Yes.
They spent big chunks of their lives just doing that to keep their families clothed and warm. And all that work must have really taken a toll on their bodies. I don't know if archaeologists have studied the bones of these women who are buried with spinning and weaving equipment to see, like, are their backs hunched? Do they have arthritis in their fingers?
Or carpal tunnel, for example.
Yeah. So I don't know if anybody's really studied that, because I know they studied the warriors to see how they died or what kind of wounds and injuries they've had on their bodies. But I wonder if they even can tell.
Well, a lot of times I don't think there's enough left of the skeleton to even be able to find out for sure.
Yeah. And one of the most famous depictions of weaving comes from Njal's saga, and it also includes the Valkyries. So this is just before the Battle of Clontarf, and you know about that, don't you? I don't know much about that battle. It was in Ireland.
Yes.
There was a man named Dorand, and he saw 12 women riding horses, and then they disappeared into the women's hut, the place where the women did their weaving. And curious, Dorand peeked into the window, and he discovered that the women were working on a loom. This was no ordinary loom. And this loom, men's heads were used for the weights, men's intestines for the weft and the warp. A sword was used for the sword beater, and an arrow was used for the pin beater. So this, instead of having nice little clay or soapstone weights, we have men's heads. And that's not all young Doran saw. While they were working, they spoke these verses about a battle. The heavens will be garish with the gore of men while the slaughter wardens sing their song. The Valkyries sing their song. And then once they're finished, the Valkyries, they pulled down that finished cloth and then they tore it into 12 pieces, each keeping her own piece. So that just shows a little bit of how men felt about, or these storytellers felt about, women weaving the fates of men, at least on this particular battlefield. They weren't just collecting the men. These women were weaving their fate.
Yes. Very chilling.
Yeah. And I think that's probably like that's got to be an older version of Valkyries than the other ones where, like, they fall in love with mortal men and things like that. They're beautiful with their golden hair and their fair skin and stuff. So I don't know. I think this was the original vision of what the Valkyries were like.
Well, there's quite a bit of evidence that men just feared women, and even regardless of whether they were beautiful or not, they were still fearsome.
Yeah,
in the Viking Age.
I think that's really interesting and that just shows up in mythologies a lot of places. These women who weave and spin men's fate, or
Yes.
everybody's fate. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, and the three fates, that goes back to Greek mythology, and then the Nornir are also often spoken of as three. But then, as we've talked in earlier episodes, the Nornir can refer to a lot of different groups of women, including this group that's been described of 12, which of course adds up to three. So it's a mystical number, just like 9. And those groups of women appear in many places having to do with doom and fate. It's not just the three fates, but it's also these many different groups of women who have a lot of power over the lives and the fates of men. And men.
Then we have one other saga or a little piece of a saga where there's a weaving was involved, and this woman was having a prophetic dream, which was a very popular thing in the sagas. Lots of prophetic dreaming, especially with women. So there's a woman named Ingeborg who was a jarl's daughter, and on her wedding night, with an arranged marriage, she had a dream. And when she woke, she told her husband about it. She said, "I dreamed that I was standing here on this estate, and I thought that I had a gray colored cloth in the loom. It seemed as though the weights were attached to the cloth, and I was weaving. When one of the weights fell down from the middle of the cloth, I noticed that the weights were the heads of men."
Ooh.
She took up one of the heads and she recognized it. And when her husband asked whose head it was, she said it was King Harold Gormson's. And her husband said, "Well, it's better dreamed than not." But I don't really know what that means. Better dream than not dreamed? Better dream than not happening in real life? I'm like, that's
question. Something in the translation is missing,
maybe. Or else it was supposed to be enigmatic. And then their son ended up killing that King Harold. So it must be why she had a dream. But that's just a little snippet of a piece of. And then, as I mentioned in the intro, the Viking Age could not have happened without the Viking longship. And that Viking longship required a massive square sail. And women were responsible for weaving and sewing those sails. And a Viking longship sail could be up to 100 square feet in size.
Wow.
And I'm terrible with numbers, so I can't really even picture that. But you've sailed. Like, how big is 100? Is that a big sail, or is it
huge? It's
huge.
Is it? But these are square sails too. And so, well, think about your house, So think about a room. 100 square feet is a big room.
That is a big room.
Yeah.
So, and the square sail consisted of several. I mean, they couldn't just have one piece of
panels.
So there were lots of panels of cloth that were sewn together, and then it was greased with some kind of fatty substance like tallow or fish oil, and then mixed with ochre to reduce the air permeability.
Yes.
And then that also kind of smoothed out irregularities
and helped to preserve it too.
Yeah. Probably helped it be waterproof as well, I bet.
Yes, because that was one of the things I kept always wondered about. And there's some places where I read where they think they may have used tar as well, like pine tar, as in a thin mixture too. But they had to make these sails last. So yeah, I always wondered because Dacron is what we use for sails nowadays, and it's and before it was cotton canvas. And so, but linen sails would have taken forever to make. There's just no way you could have a sail of linen because it took so long to make the thread and to spin it and then to weave it. But there's many different types of wool, and there's something called hard wool, which is, more of a smooth finish. It's not like what you make a sweater out of or even a jacket, but I've seen men's suits that are made out of hard wool, and they're very smooth and fairly thin. And so if you treated that fabric I can see where it would really last a long time and be very sturdy, and it would hold its shape more. It would be more stiff.
That makes sense. And then I also read that the wool it came from sheep with a higher content of lanolin, so that would make it more water repellent.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and then it was estimated that about 500 sheep were shorn for one sale.
Oh my God.
This is coming from the Viking ship museum in Roskilde.
I
guess they've done like replicas and things, and so they had to really figure it out, and that it could take over 4 years to weave one sail.
Oh, I totally believe that.
I do too. Yeah. But like you said, it would last a long time. And they were saying that if properly maintained, which I'm sure they tried their best to do that, a Viking age sail would last 40 to 50 years. So that was a lifetime for, most of those people. So yeah. And I'm sure, I don't know that I've ever read. I know they would sometimes bring their ships up and put them, like dry dock them or whatever you could call that, to keep them. But I don't know if I've ever read what they did with their sails.
Oh, I'm sure that they worked on them over the winter.
Oh,
repairing
mending them, re-oiling them, or.
Oh, and there are places along, especially on the west coast of Norway, where they found boathouses, big, huge, like boat barns. And so they definitely stored the ships over the winter and worked on, they were workshops where they repaired them and kept them out of the weather during the winter storms. In fact, there's one at Avaldsnes that you can actually go inside, and we were actually able to visit. It was very impressive.
Neat. Yeah, I think I had that in my first book. My character's father had his ship in like a big barn, and they would they worked on it. But I didn't even think about the sail.
Yeah, well, and I do have them reweaving patches in the sails, and how, whether, since we haven't really found a sail or anything that we can say definitively is a sail, they also had awnings that they put, hung over the ship. And that's how it was, like a tent that they sheltered in at night. And that's mentioned in the sagas a lot. When they were traveling, they put up the awning for the night.
And they had tents too for when they were camping out. Yeah. And women would make all those things. I don't know. Did the women do the oiling? And
I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know if that was part of their job, or that got once they did the weaving, they just handed it off to somebody else to do that other part of it.
Yeah, there's not much mentioned about that, but there is a thing called tanbark sails. And that is something that was later, and it wasn't necessarily Scandinavian, but they were treated over a fire. It was a preservative. And so that was something that was much later on in history, but it may have evolved from some of the treatments that they gave sails in the Viking age. And I'm sure not just the Vikings. I'm sure some of the other cultures too had treatments for cloth, because they didn't use linen. They had to have used wool, everybody, because cotton wasn't even around.
Right.
At least in the Northern European countries. So
I just picture all these women, sitting around working on these sails.
Yeah. And of course, now we know why they were checkered and striped, is because they did these strips on their loom, and then they'd take the strip off and sew them together.
That's just another example. We've mentioned it before that, they had the Vikings, these medieval people weren't just drab. These ships were like striped and had all kinds of neat colors. Yeah,
there's traces of paint all over the place. So spinning was forbidden during the Yule season. It was considered bad luck. And I don't know all the particulars, but you had to have all your spinning done by the Yule season. So then after Yule, they set up the looms. The weaving was mostly done on these really large, upright, warp-weighted looms, one of which was found on the Oseberg ship that was actually had a weaving loaded onto it. And they have evidence that the weaving was done in separate buildings called dingya. and men were not allowed in these buildings. In fact, some of the sagas suggest that men were afraid to enter them. So I have, a women's bower in my novels, and those have been mentioned too. They weren't necessarily just a hut. They may have been a whole, women's hall where they did all kinds of work. But
and then in the Valkyrie's loom, she mentioned that the huts that were almost like they were semi-subterranean. They were underground a little bit, and they
were pit houses. Yeah.
Yeah, and she said they didn't even really seem to have clear entrances. And so it's almost like they were climbing in and out of the earth, which to me symbolizes like the womb of the earth, right? They're climbing, they're going in and they're weaving and then they're coming out. I just think I'm sure it was practical for them, maybe, but to me, it's very symbolic.
And it probably was for them too. But
Yeah,
pit houses were very common in the Viking Age. And so they were dug down about, 3 or 4 feet into the ground. And then when they talk about going to the thing, to the assemblies, some families would have these pit houses that belonged to their family, like a summer cabin or something. And they would, some of them were temporary, where you just like pitch kind of a tent over it. Some of them were more permanent. So they were like a cabin. So they were commonly used for many, many things, including weaving.
That makes me think back when I was in high school, I was living in Southern California in a beach town. And on the 4th of July, I don't know, they would have like a huge fireworks thing, and people would go down to this one particular beach. But like once the sun went down, people just started shooting off fireworks, and it was kind of dangerous. So people would get to the beach super early in the morning and dig pits, big pits that were like 5-6 feet deep. And then you go down in that pit and you'd put your chairs and stuff in there. And then it was also cool, like during the day.
Yeah.
And so then we'd go hang out and play beach volleyball, go swimming, walk around and stuff, go back to our little pit house. And then once it got dark and the fireworks started flying, everybody just sat in their pit houses and just kind of looked up.
Oh, interesting. And you probably had a good view that way too.
Yeah, it was really fun. And they ended up banning it because it left a huge mess on the beach. I think, maybe a year or two after I left home, they stopped doing it because somebody had to go in and fill in those pits. There was trash. And so, but yeah, I just now was thinking that was a pit house.
Yeah. Yep. No, they're mentioned quite a bit in the sagas, and they found in Norway in particular, they've found places that they think were assembly places or thing places where people would come to assemble for their legislature. And they found these pit houses that were kind of surrounding an area. And so there've been evidence of a lot of that. And they were used in Iceland as well. So thinking of them as a weaving building, and they were heated. They had fireplaces in them, and so the women would congregate there. And some of them were bigger than others, I'm guessing. In my books, they're quite large, and they're not pit houses. I actually have a big hall, and we don't know for sure, but we do know that there are auxiliary halls in many of these places, many of the big royal steadings. Now, whether those were guest houses or whether they were women's houses, we just don't know. So there's a variety of things.
I have a women's house, a weaving house in my books too.
Mm-hmm.
It's just a regular structure where they could put up their standing looms and the women would congregate. And
because you can't take them down. I mean, they have to stay up during the whole time that you're weaving. So that makes sense. Wadma was the basic twill fabric, and it became in Michelle in the Valkyrie book. She talks about it becoming a currency, an actual standard currency during the early Middle Ages. And the sails were made from this fabric. It was the fabric was fulled, which is a process that shrinks and thickens the fabric. And then they were sewn together in vertical stripes. And impregnated with this mixture that you're talking about, whether it was sheep tallow, fish oil, tar, which made it watertight and water repellent, wind tight. That comes from the book, The Woven Coverlets of Norway, which is a very interesting book too, that talks about weaving in the Middle Ages and later.
Yeah, you mentioned the large let's going to call it a loom.
Freudian slip.
Yeah, right. I don't know how much do we even want to describe how it was set up. It's hard to picture it. So they've got the loom. It's like two beams, and then you've got the warp thread that goes vertically and the weft thread that goes horizontally, and the
warp thread is actually hanging and
right.
It's weighted. It's
weighted by
hanging from the upper rod.
Yeah. By warp weights, which are usually made out of clay or
sometimes
soapstone.
Men's heads.
Sometimes men's heads.
Yeah. So whatever's handy. If you have a lot of heads laying around, you can use those.
And there's a lot of those. I mean, if you think about how thin threads are, by the time you have them all hanging, there's a lot of the weights down at the bottom. So yeah. Yeah. And then the two layers of the warp threads are held apart by a heddle. It's a piece of wood, and it can be adjusted, it can be moved. And then the weaver uses a shuttle, which is usually like a stick that has yarn, and it goes weaves in and out of that's the weft thread that's going horizontally in and out of the warp threads.
Right. So, and then you use a beater to beat those warp threads up so they're tight and even. Right. And a lot of times it's more than one person doing this weaving, because the looms are pretty wide. They found one, as I said, on the Oseberg ship, and you can see replicas of them in quite a few museums. One person could do it, but it would go much faster with at least two people working at the loom together. And they were big enough that you really could.
And I can imagine the like the clickety clack of those warp weights being like this constant sound in the women's house.
Yeah.
I don't know if it might be kind of soothing to them.
I don't know. That's a good question.
And then the women also did tablet weaving. It's a kind of braiding. And this one, I'm not even sure how to describe it, but this was used to like decorate clothing, like hems, belts, headbands. There was usually some kind of neat geometric pattern that would run along it. They're really pretty. I like tablet weaving.
You can still find tablet weaving today. It's something that's still done. In fact, I found a really good website talking about it, but it was very complicated.
Yeah.
It could be very complicated.
It's like there's like these little, the reason it's called tablet weaving is they have these little tablets. They're like the size of
they're little cards.
Like a playing card.
Card weaving.
Card weaving.
Another name for it.
They're about the size of playing cards, only they're square, not rectangular, and they have holes in them. The warp thread goes through those holes. And then
you turn them
and twist them, and
it's can be very complex. There's some simpler ones and some that are just, and remembering the patterns. See, they didn't write them down. I mean, in modern days, we actually use, weaving patterns that are, on paper. Well, they didn't have that. So they actually had to remember how to do some of these. Yeah. And that's something I have in my, my latest book, my last book, The Queen of War. Osa is befuddling another sorceress the sorceress is weaving a tablet weaving, and she's remembering the pattern, and Osa starts doing one in her head. And so this sorceress is trying to read Osa's mind. And so Osa turns it on her and confuses her by doing her own card weaving in her head.
Oh, interesting.
Little psychological warfare, little psychological battle going on. Yeah, it was really fun to write, but I had to research a lot, and I actually found a few YouTube videos of people doing this card weaving.
Yeah.
In fact, my husband has a guitar band, from a guitar strap that was tablet woven.
Oh yeah,
I'm sure it's all done by machine now, but it's not a lost art.
Yeah, if any of the listeners are interested, just go on YouTube and look up tablet weaving, and you can find somebody actually doing it. You know, you were talking about Osa messing up that enchantress, and I'm thinking of like when I would be doing anything with numbers or trying to keep track, and like my brother would start yelling out other numbers just to mess me up.
Yeah, same kind of a thing.
Be like trying to keep track, you're counting in your head, and somebody else is doing counting other numbers, or they're talking to you, and you're like, shush, 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 I need to concentrate.
And in the Viking age, they didn't write things down.
No.
So being able to have these things in your mind, hold these things in your mind, was much more important and probably a lot more developed than it is for us. Because I mean, everything was memorized.
Yeah,
So,
their memories must have just been off the charts.
Yeah,
how good they must have been. Yeah,
very different turn of mind than what we have,
mm-hmm.
because we have everything written down.
And then, of course, the Viking women also did embroidery.
Yes,
to decorate clothing, and some of the rich Vikings even could use gold and silver thread.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah,
and we found traces of all these things.
Mm-hmm.
The Oseberg tapestry uses a very interesting method of a combination of brocading and kind of like an embroidery. They actually outlined the characters with
neat.
Yeah, and it's so complicated I don't even want to describe it, but it's very interesting. It's not necessarily what was always used, but they would weave in some of these things, and then they would also outline them with what was similar to an embroidery technique.
And then, of course, Viking age women would have upcycled their clothing.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Things that somebody outgrew would be turned into something else. A blanket might be, clothes might be turned into a blanket or whatever. I'm sure they didn't throw anything away that didn't absolutely have to be thrown away.
No.
Well, and where did they get all this wool from?
Yeah. So they had, different breeds of sheep render different kinds of wool. And the Norwegian sheep that they used back then had a dual layer coat. So there was an outer coat of these long, smooth hairs called guard hairs. And the inner layer was short, soft wool. And so the different types of wool had to be separated from each other and sorted according to quality. And the season that the wool was shorn made a difference too. Spring wool was weaker than fall wool because, of course, the sheep that overwintered weren't fed as well. They were kept in a byre over the winter and just fed with fodder. There wasn't necessarily grazing where they lived. So they used wool combs. They didn't use the carding like we're used to. They used long combs they discovered quite a few of them in the Viking age graves. And they were used to comb out and align these guard hairs before they were spun, because otherwise they'd be kind of, all in a jumble. And they just combed out these long hairs, and then they would put them on the distaff and spin them. The guard hairs were stronger, and they were used for weft weaving. And the softer wool was used for knitting. Or the Vikings had an art called nail binding, which is like knitting, but without the needles. And they also used the softer wool for warp threads. Wool gathering, the term wool gathering actually comes from going out and finding tufts of wool, that were stuck on bushes from the sheep. And they'd gather these up and put them in a basket and bring them home.
I used that term not too long ago, a few months ago. Somebody asked something. I was like, I was just wool gathering. And they were like, what? What does that mean? And I'm like, it just means I'm just kind of off in my own little space in my head. And
So I've read in some places that the wool was washed after it was shorn, and that makes sense. And then it was sorted and carefully stored for the weaving season. But I've also seen photographs in this Woven Coverlets of Norway. I saw photos of women washing the sheep before they sheared them. So I don't know, maybe they did both. It's hard to say, maybe. But washing a whole sheep looks kind of, I have a scene in one of my books where they do wash a sheep because it was so entertaining, but and obviously they did it. So it's very interesting. It seems like it would be much easier to wash the wool after they
Yeah.
shear. I don't know.
And then I read somewhere that blankets were made from a shaggy wool.
Mm-hmm.
It must
Yes.
be. And
And
that they
even
could
some
be really
cloaks.
heavy. That they, oh, cloaks too, yeah. That they could be really heavy, the
And
blankets.
they shed water really well. Would
Yeah.
warm.
And then there's the dreaded spinning.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
That is the one, well, there's lots of things, but spinning just looks so tedious to me. I
I
don't,
tried it.
did
Oh
you
my
try
gosh, I
it?
cannot do it. I cannot do it. I have tried and tried. I mean, the YouTube videos look really easy. It's not. So, I
Yeah.
mean, I guess maybe I don't have the spinning gene or something.
Well, maybe it takes a lot of practice. Maybe you didn't grow up doing it.
Right. I'm sure there's people who could learn it better than me, but every Norse girl learned to spin probably as soon as she could walk. And the spinning wheel wasn't invented for several centuries. So this yarn was spun laboriously by hand using a drop spindle. And that's what I'm talking about that I tried to learn how to use. And oh my goodness, it looks easy and it's not. So a really very common find in archaeology, not just in Scandinavia, but all over the world, is these spindle whorls, which were weights made from anything from stone or bone or ceramic or glass. And they used it to weight the spindle. And I was in Belize, and we went on into some Mayan ruins, and our guide told us they found spindle whorls there.
Oh,
so I mean,
yeah.
they're universal. It's very interesting.
Yeah. And then there was the distaff so you have the distaff in one hand and the spindle in the other, and the distaff, which was what, like a couple feet?
Yeah, 2 or 3 feet.
Feet, huh? Yeah, it's made out of wood. And I always thought when the wool is on the distaff, it looks like cotton candy.
Yeah, it
because
does.
it's still kind of fluffy, and then it gets pulled off of that onto the weighted spindle, and then it spins. That's why it's called spinning, and it spins it, twists it, so it becomes yarn, basically.
And archaeologists can tell there's different directions. It's spun, Z-spun,
right,
or there's two different directions of spinning, and some very interesting articles about that. Also, the distaffs were thought of as also being the vulva's wand.
Yeah.
We found metal distaff-like implements in graves that would have been too heavy to use for spinning, because they actually tucked these distaffs in their belt, but they were apparently emblematic of a distaff.
Yeah. And they'd have jewels on the top. And,
and one had a little house, a little house on the top of it. Very interesting stories about these distaffs.
And I can't remember why, I've read it that one of the reasons why Vikings took so many slaves is they needed people to help with this wool production.
It wouldn't surprise me.
And the final thing they did, well, before they sewed it, was they dyed it.
Yes, they used natural plants, some of them local and some of them imported. A lot of the dyes were not light fast, but there were some that could be pretty light fast. There were yellow dyes that were made from club moss and lichens and some species of willow. Red came from lichen or madder, which was imported from Europe. And apparently woad was grown in Norway. I've read that. But the spun wool was dyed in vats in an outbuilding, and the dye was set with urine. And I had visited Norway many years ago and visited some relatives of mine on my mother's side, and the grandmother was there, and she was living in this little cottage, and she was showing us some of her handiwork, and she said, you have to use the first water of the morning because to set the dyes, because it's the strongest. I'll never forget that.
Well, I guess that makes sense. Yeah, and blue is a very favorite color of the Vikings. That shows up all the time in the literature. but they'd also just had regular shades of brown or various hues of white, whatever the sheep might have looked like. And it just depended on when you dyed it, if you dyed it before this or after that, all kinds of different
techniques.
Yes, for how you would get that dye. And then of course they would weave together, more than one color into these sails or garments or blankets or tapestries. So, and then there's a story about King Harold Greycloak. He's a Norwegian king, and he got his nickname from literally wearing a gray cloak. The story is that a trader from Iceland had arrived in Norway with a shipment of gray cloaks, and nobody wanted his gray cloaks. Poor guy. I don't know. I'm trying to imagine, were they like a really ugly color of gray or
Well, maybe they wanted,
blue?
blue. Yeah, probably blue.
Yeah. So the trader went to King Harold, who, and I love this, according to the saga, he was a kindly mannered man and merry hearted. I'm like, it make him sound like Santa Claus. So then Harold asked the trader if he could have one, and he started wearing it. And then all the other men fell into line and bought the trader's gray cloaks. And Harold was forever known as Harold Greycloak.
I like that story.
So he was a Viking age influencer.
Yep, exactly.
And then finally, we have, we mentioned it briefly. There's weaving, lots of weaving with goddesses in mythology, not just Norse mythology with the vulva and the Nornir, but also Greek mythology that we mentioned with the fates. And then there's stories of weaving, and like in Greek mythology, there's the story of Athena and Arachne. People might recognize Arachne for arachnid with spiders because she was a very skilled weaver. So skilled, she challenged the goddess Athena. Well, we all know how challenging gods and goddesses goes. So they had a competition to weave a tapestry. And Athena became so angry because Arachne's tapestry was so good and so perfect. And she also depicted the gods behaving badly, that Athena tore it apart, and Arachne became so upset she hanged herself.
Oh,
yeah. And then Athena took pity on her and transformed her into a spider, and that's where the term arachnid comes from arachnid.
Hey.
And then there's the story of Penelope in the Odyssey, when Odysseus went off to war and was gone for so long, when her suitors started showing up at her house, and she told them she would choose, after she finished weaving, a burial shroud for her father-in-law. But then every night she'd unravel it. Crafty old Penelope. The Egyptians had a weaving goddess and patron of weavers named, and I'm not sure how to say her name, Teut or Tate. And she was also associated with mummification.
Oh.
Yeah.
Well, didn't they wrap them in linen winding sheets?
In linen bandages.
Before they mummified them.
And then in the United States, in the Navajo cosmology, Spider Woman wove the universe into being, and she taught Navajo women how to weave. And if you've ever seen a Navajo blanket, they are such beautiful works of art. They are just incredible.
Yes.
Spider Woman did a good job.
I wonder if that was Arachne.
And Spider Woman also captures misbehaving children in her net. So, yeah. And of course, we have a lot of fairy tales with spinning wheels, people making bargains over that kind of thing. Yeah, like we have Sleeping Beauty with the spinning wheel, Rumpelstiltskin, as we mentioned before. Then there's a famous Norwegian fairy tale called The Three Ants. Have you heard that one before?
I haven't.
Yeah. It's very fairy tale-ish. So it's a young woman who, she doesn't know how to spin. And so but the queen loves her. And so the other maids try to sabotage her by saying, oh, she can spin a pound of flax in 24 hours.
Oh.
So then she, put in a room overnight to spin the flax, this old old woman comes up to her and says, I'll help you if you'll call me auntie on the happiest day. And then she's visited, that happens 3 more times with weaving and then sewing. And then the happiest day of her life happens to be her wedding to the prince. And then these 3 old women show up, and the prince is, and one of them, they're all kind of old and hunched, and old auntie who showed up to help her spin, she has a long nose, I
Oh,
guess from like leaning over, sticking her nose into her spinning or something like that. And then the auntie who showed up, who was the weaving one, she had like a humped back from like hunching over the weaving. And then the third one who had helped her sew, her eyes are all watery and bleary and stuff from staring at her sewing all the time. So then the prince goes, how are these 3 old hags, related to my beautiful bride? And they say, well, we were once beautiful like her, but spinning
oh,
did this and weaving did that and
oh,
sewing did this. And so he goes, all right, my bride will never have to spin, weave, or sew a day in her life.
wow.
Yeah, it was interesting. And it kind of made me think maybe that's why I was asking, like, I wonder if they found in archaeology that these tasks have
Oh,
actually affected their bodies. Because I wonder if like some of these women end up hunched because they have to hunch over their sewing or whatever.
oh,
Yeah.
a lifetime of that. Yeah, for
Hmm.
sure. Oh,
And that this huge fairy tale is not to have to be able to do that for the rest of her life.
right.
That's the boon, is to not have to weave, sew, or spin. I mean, it's typical fairy tale stuff,
Mhm.
locked away and having to do a task, a magical being 3 times it happens, and then it's all coming back to her.
Well, it's
So,
got the three Norns or fairies,
yeah.
and it's got elements of Rumpelstiltskin in it. I
Hmm.
mean, it's very interesting.
Yeah, yeah. And then we have our English word spinster,
Yes.
which comes from spinning. And I don't think originally it was a derogative term. I think
No,
it
I think it was a
was,
profession,
oh,
because
yeah.
Webster was
Oh,
also, and those, I was reading, I'm trying to remember where I read this, but it was very interesting that those terms like spinster, Webster, and a couple other things, they were originally women's last names for
oh,
women's trades, not
oh,
men's. And that was, so it's very, very interesting. I just can't remember right off the top of my head where I read that. I have to
oh,
find the source, but it wasn't that long ago that I was reading about that.
yeah.
Oh,
Huh.
another thing is that Orion's belt was known to the Vikings as Frigg's distaff.
Nice.
So that, and
Yeah.
that was Orion's belt was a very important part of Viking navigation,
Mm,
along with the North Star
mhm.
Polaris.
So much work. When I was reading this, going, oh my gosh, I'm so glad I live now and I can just go to a store and buy
Oh,
clothes,
I know, I know.
go to a store and buy food, go to the store and buy beer. Especially the clothes part. I'm just uh, to have to actually do all that work just to get
I
the
know.
raw
Well,
materials and then have to spin that into thread. It's
yeah.
mind-boggling.
Well, when I was growing up, women still sewed a lot of
Me
clothes,
too.
but
Yeah.
you bought the fabric. I mean, you didn't
Hmm.
you didn't
Right.
weave it.
Exactly.
But
Yeah.
in fact, when I was in junior high, we had to take home ec, and in home economics, we learned to sew along with other things like boiling an egg and so forth.
Yeah. I had to take sewing as well.
Hmm.
But I also took wood shop and metal shop and
Hmm.
drafting. So that was
Yep.
kind of fun. I actually
Yep.
liked drafting the best.
Well, that would be good. Yeah. Yeah, we had all those practical things, including civics. Imagine that.
Oh yeah, I had to take civics. Oh,
One of the many things that have gone by the wayside. I
yeah.
even learned to balance a checkbook in,
In
I want to
school.
say, in grade school, I think. But anyway, I do remember learning that in school. And those practical arts were kind of important.
They were.
Yeah.
I learned how to type in school too.
Yep. Yep.
My mother had already taught me how to type, but I took a typing class and yeah.
Mhm. Yeah.
That's one skill that has come in very handy because I can type like nobody's business. I can
Oh,
type
good
really
for you.
fast.
I never was very good at it. I did take a typing class, but I was never very good. So
Yeah. I love to type. So, well, that was a lot. That was fun.
It was.
And I'm glad we gave women their due.
Indeed.
And let's remind everyone that the Viking Age might not have happened if we hadn't had those women.
That's right. That's
Yeah.
right. And there's also a lot of evidence that those women went on these voyages. They
Yeah.
didn't stay home. That's been the common belief, but those women actually went. There have been a lot of Viking women's burials found all over, all over Europe. And so I guess that's something we can talk about next time is, some of the travels of Viking women. And
Oh, yeah.
I know that when they did a lot of the archaeology having to do with the Great Army, there were women, whether they were combatants or not is not known, but there were women that came and settled in these places. So Scandinavian women. And also, in Iceland, they've shown that a lot of the women were Irish. They were Irish slaves that were brought over there, for example, but there are also a lot of Scandinavian women. So we could look into that a little bit.
Sounds good. Women on the move.
Travels of women. Yep, exactly.
All right. Well, that's been great.
Yes.
I'll see you next time. Thanks for listening. You can find Johanna at johannawittenberg.com, where you'll find a free short story, a prequel to her Norse Queen series. And you can find me, K.S., at ksbarton.com, where you can also find a free short story from me, a prequel to my Norse family series. See you next time.